private property. No exceptions. For Clark Whitman, Lake Crystal was more than just water. It was a lifetime of memories, a sanctuary passed down through generations. But when Evergreen Development locked it behind gates and no trespassing signs, it was supposed to be over. Defeated and broken, Clark stood at the fence, his tackle box in hand, wondering if he'd ever cast his line again. Then the air trembled with the rumble of engines. Military trucks thundered down the road, their steel frames gleaming and marked with the trident insignia of the Navy SEALs. What happened next would change everything, in a way Clark never expected. Let's step into this unforgettable journey. Clark Whitman had spent his entire life in Willowbrook. The small lakeside community was all he'd ever known, a quiet slice of rural America where people still waved at neighbors and local gossip was exchanged over coffee at the diner. But for Clark, the true heart of this place had always been Lake Crystal. It wasn't just a body of water to him, it was his family's legacy, a piece of history woven into his soul. His father had taken him fishing there when he was just 5 years old, guiding his small, trembling hands as he cast his first line into the cool, rippling water. "Keep it steady, son," his father had said, his voice warm and patient. "Fishing teaches patience. The best things come to those who wait." Those words echoed in Clark's mind throughout his life. They weren't just about fishing. They were about resilience, about finding calm even in the roughest waters. From then on, Lake Crystal became more than just a place. It became a living memory. The spot where his father taught him to tie his first fishing knot, where they'd spend lazy Saturdays together, reeling in bass and sharing stories only a father and son could understand. His father's words had stayed with him through marriage, children, and even after his wife Lois passed away. The lake was his constant companion, a sanctuary where he knew every cove and secret spot the fish liked to hide in during the early morning hours. The cabin Clark owned by the lake was modest, a weathered, single-story retreat built with his own hands over 30 years ago. Its peeling paint and creaky porch spoke of age and use, but to Clark it was perfect, a place where he spent weekends and summer evenings soaking in the serene beauty of Lake Crystal. The scent of pine mingled with the crisp, clean air, and the gentle lap of water against the shore was a melody he never tired of. But the lake itself belonged to everyone. It had always been that way. All of that changed when Evergreen Development bought up the surrounding land 3 months ago. Their arrival was swift and relentless. Billboards sprouted along the main road, advertising Crystal Shores estates, luxury, living by the water, renderings of sleek modern homes perched elegantly along pristine manicured shores flashed on every screen and sign. Promises of exclusivity, comfort, and luxury filled their brochures, each word twisting the knife a little deeper. The man from Evergreen Development showed up at the town meeting in an expensive suit that looked out of place in the humble wood-paneled community hall. His polished smile and smooth tone radiated confidence, the kind only money and power could buy. "We're creating an exclusive lakeside community," he announced, his voice echoing through the murmurs of the crowded room. "Crystal Shores Estates will be the most sought-after development in the state. High-end homes, private amenities, security, all designed to offer our residents the finest experience nature can provide. What about the rest of us?" Clark had stood up, his voice firm but cracking slightly with the effort. "That lake's been public for over 100 years. My grandfather fished there, my father fished there, and I've been fishing there my whole life." The representative offered a polite, practiced smile, the kind that meant his words were already set in stone. "The deed includes water rights, Mr. Whitman." "I'm sorry, but that's the law." Clark tried everything. He consulted a lawyer, but the fees were more than he could afford on his pension. The county commissioner just shrugged, saying, "Nothing we can do, Clark. They own it fair and square." Metal gates went up last week, blocking every access point. Signs warned, "No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted." Clark had stood at the main gate that first day for nearly an hour, his tackle box in hand, staring at the heavy chain and padlock. A security guard eventually approached. "Sir, you need to leave the premises." Clark's voice was quiet yet unyielding. "I've been fishing here for 60 years. The guard's response was cold. "Not anymore. Mr. Luthor doesn't want locals disturbing the natural setting. Property values depend on exclusivity." Clark walked home that day, his tackle box feeling heavier than ever. His grandson Thomas was visiting next month. He'd promised to teach him to fish, just as his father had taught him. That night, Clark sat on his porch, staring at the distant shimmer of lake water through the trees. For the first time in his life, he felt like a trespasser in his own hometown. The next morning, Clark decided to try one last time. His knees ached with every step as he walked the long, winding trail few people knew about. When he reached the secluded north shore, he saw two men in suits surveying the area, with a bulldozer idling behind them. "We'll clear this section first," one of the men said, pointing to a cluster of ancient oak trees. "The model homes need the best view of the water." Clark stepped back, trying to avoid being seen, but his foot snagged on a root and he stumbled, dropping his tackle box. The metallic clatter of lures against rocks drew the men's attention. The taller man approached, his expression stern. "This is private property, sir." "How did you get past the gates?" Clark straightened his back, defiant. "I've been walking this path since before you were born. Just wanted to fish one last time." The man sighed, his annoyance poorly masked. "I understand this is difficult, but we have investors waiting. Security will escort you out." As they waited, Clark noticed a young man sitting on a rock near the shore, quietly observing the scene. The security guard soon arrived, his irritation clear. "Let's go, old man. Mr. Luthor doesn't want delays on this project." As Clark was led away, he passed the young man on the rock. He noticed the man's water bottle had tipped over, its contents spilling onto the dirt. "Your water," Clark said, bending down to pick it up despite the guard's impatient tugging. The young man looked surprised. "Thanks. Most people wouldn't bother." Clark's voice was gentle. "No trouble. My son was in the service too, Navy." The young man tilted his head. "How'd you know I was in the military?" Clark gave a faint smile. "The haircut, the posture. My son looked just the same when he came home on leave," the guard grumbled, pulling Clark's arm. "Let's go, old man." But as Clark walked away, the young man continued to watch him, a thoughtful expression on his face, and Clark didn't see him reach for his phone. That evening, Clark sat at his kitchen table, spreading old photo albums before him. Pictures of 3 generations of Whitmans fishing at the lake lay scattered like pieces of a broken history. His neighbor and longtime friend Will sat across from him, shaking his head. "They're starting construction tomorrow," Clark said quietly, his voice hoarse with resignation, "cutting down the old oaks." Will let out a sigh of frustration. "It's not right. That lake belongs to everyone." "Not anymore," Clark replied, shutting the album with a defeated thud. "I promised Thomas I'd teach him to fish when he visits. Now I'll have to drive 2 hours to the state park." "Did you try talking to the town council again?" Will asked, though he already knew the answer. Clark nodded, his face worn and weary. "They said their hands are tied. Luthor made donations to everyone's campaigns last year. Nobody wants to cross him." Later that night, Clark couldn't sleep. The darkness outside felt heavier than usual, like the weight of the lake's loss was pressing down on him. He woke to the sound of knocking. The clock read 5:30 a.m. Pulling on his robe, Clark shuffled to the door, his bones creaking with every step. When he opened the door, 4 men stood before him in civilian clothes, their backs straight, eyes sharp. The man in front looked familiar. "Mr. Whitman, I'm Richard Todd. We met briefly yesterday by the lake." Clark recognized him as the young man sitting on the rock. "I remember. What brings you here so early? May we come in? We'd like to talk to you about Lake Crystal." Clark hesitated before stepping aside. The men entered and sat at his kitchen table, their presence a strange but comforting intrusion. Clark poured coffee, his hands trembling slightly as he set the mugs in front of them. "I hope you don't mind the early hour," Richard said. "We wanted to catch you before the construction starts." "We're all active-duty Navy SEALs," another man explained. "On leave for 2 weeks. I'm Jason, this is Timothy and Damien." Clark placed the last mug on the table and sat down. "My son served 2 tours with the Navy, but I don't understand why you're here." Richard leaned forward, his expression earnest. "After we met yesterday, I made some calls. Your son was Jonathan Whitman, correct?" Clark nodded slowly, his chest tightening. "Jonathan saved my commanding officer's life in Kandahar 4 years ago. Lieutenant Commander Grayson. Your son took a bullet meant for him." Clark's hands trembled as he gripped the coffee cup. "Jonathan never told me the details about his service." "He wouldn't have," Richard said. But the lieutenant never forgot. When I told him what was happening with your lake, he made some calls. Jason pulled out a folder and laid it on the table. We did some research on Evergreen Development. They've been cutting corners on environmental regulations, and the water rights they claim to have? There are some serious questions about how they acquired them, Timothy chimed in, his voice steady and confident. The lieutenant has connections with environmental lawyers who specialize in water rights cases. They're willing to take your case pro bono. Clark looked at them with suspicion and hope mingling in his eyes. Why would they do that for me? Richard's gaze was unwavering. Because your son is a hero to a lot of people, and because what's happening here isn't right. Clark stared down at his coffee, struggling to process everything. I appreciate the thought, but Luther has money and influence. The bulldozers are starting today. Damien, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. That's why we're here in person. We're not just bringing legal help, we're bringing media attention. Several of us have large social media followings from our training videos. Richard added, and Lieutenant Commander Grayson now works with a national news program. They're sending a crew today. Clark looked out his window toward the lake, his voice heavy with resignation. I don't want charity. This isn't charity, sir, Richard said firmly. This is a community standing up for what's right. Your son would have done the same. Just then, a knock came at the back door. It was Will, his face pale with urgency. Clark, you need to see this. There's a whole convoy of vehicles heading to the lake. Clark stepped outside to the edge of his property, his breath catching at the sight. Cars and trucks lined the access road, some with military bumper stickers, others clearly press vans with satellite equipment. Richard stood beside Clark, his eyes surveying the crowd. Word spreads fast in our community. A group of about 20 veterans gathered near the gate. They weren't blocking access, just standing quietly in formation, their presence powerful and undeniable. Many wore caps or jackets identifying their military branches. News crews were setting up cameras, reporters murmuring into microphones. That's Sandra Wu, Richard said, nodding at the woman holding a microphone. Lieutenant Grayson's contact from National Morning News. Clark watched as a black SUV pulled up. Mr. Luther stepped out, his face red with anger, two men in suits flanking him. What is the meaning of this? Luther snapped at the security guard. Before the guard could answer, Sandra Wu approached, camera rolling. Mr. Luther, Sandra Wu with National Morning News. We're doing a story on public access to natural resources and the Lake Crystal situation. Can we get a statement from you? Luther's face twisted with frustration. This is private property. I have no comment. Richard nudged Clark. Let's go down there. Clark and Richard made their way down the hill toward the growing crowd. Clark's heart pounded, but this time it wasn't from defeat. As they approached, Clark saw more familiar faces arriving, neighbors he had known his whole life, families with children. Even the mayor and two council members stood awkwardly near the back, their discomfort evident. Luther was trying to push past the reporter. I have permits and legal rights to this property. These people are trespassing. Richard stepped forward, voice calm but firm. Actually, sir, they're standing on the public road. No one has crossed your gate. At that moment, the environmental lawyer who had arrived with the seals approached Luther. I'm Duke Morrison, environmental law specialist. We filed an emergency injunction this morning regarding your water rights claims. He handed Luther a thick document. Our research indicates the deed transfer from 1967 specifically excluded lake access rights. Those remained with the county. Luther's face reddened. My legal team reviewed everything. This is a delay tactic. Perhaps your team missed some details, Morrison replied calmly. The county archives provided the original documents this morning. The judge has ordered all construction halted pending review. Clark watched as Luther conferred urgently with his associates. More townspeople continued to arrive. Someone had brought coffee and donuts. Children ran playing between groups of adults. Sandra Wu approached Clark, microphone in hand. Mr. Whitman, would you be willing to share your story? We understand you've been fishing this lake for over 60 years. Clark hesitated, uncomfortable with the attention. Richard placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice steady and reassuring. Your story matters, Mr. Whitman. It's how things change. Clark nodded slowly. My father brought me here when I was 5 years old. Taught me to fish right over there by those willows. I taught my son in the same spot. As Clark spoke, he noticed Luther watching him from a distance, his expression changing from anger to calculate. Will approached with a cup of coffee for Clark. "Half the town is here now. Even Judge Faison showed up. And he never leaves his house except for court." Clark looked around at the gathering crowd. People he'd known his entire life standing together. For the first time in months, he felt a flicker of hope. By mid-afternoon, the crowd had grown to over 200 people. The news vans had multiplied. What started as a local story was quickly gaining regional attention. Clark sat on a folding chair someone had brought him, watching as Luther huddled with his lawyers near their vehicles. The bulldozers remained silent and still. Richard approached with a tall man in his 50s. "Mr. Whitman, this is Lieutenant Commander Grayson." The officer extended his hand. "Your son saved my life, Mr. Whitman. I never got to thank his father in person." Clark stood to shake his hand, his eyes glistening. "Jonathan never mentioned it." "He wouldn't have," Grayson said, his voice roughened by emotion. "Doesn't one to boast, but I've never forgotten what he did." Sandra Wu's news segment aired on the Midday Report. The story focused on the community's fight to preserve public access to natural resources. Clark's brief interview, where he spoke about 3 generations of his family fishing the lake, became the emotional heart of the piece. By 3 o'clock, Luther requested a meeting. They gathered at a picnic table near the lake entrance. Luther, his lawyer, Clark, Richard, Grayson, Duke Morrison, and the mayor. "This situation has gotten out of hand," Luther began, his tone clipped but cautious. "I'm willing to discuss a compromise." The environmental lawyer nodded. "We're listening." "I can set aside 30% of the shoreline for public access," Luther offered. "A designated area for fishing and recreation?" Clark shook his head, his voice steady and determined. "This lake has always been for everyone. 30% isn't enough." The mayor cleared his throat, his discomfort apparent. "The county archives showed the original deed specifically preserved public access rights. We overlooked this when reviewing your permits." Luther's lawyer whispered something to him, his face darkening. "Finally," he admitted, "the negative publicity is already affecting investor confidence. I propose this. We develop only the eastern shore with luxury homes. The western shore remains public access with improved facilities that we will fund." Lieutenant Commander Grayson leaned forward. "And the environmental concerns? The runoff from construction could damage the lake ecosystem." "We'll implement additional protections beyond code requirements," Luther said, his voice now resigned, "and establish a conservation fund for the lake's long-term health." The negotiations continued for another hour. By the end, they had reached an agreement. 50% of the shoreline would remain public, with improved access points and facilities. Luther would modify his development plans to be more environmentally sensitive. A community board, including Clark, would oversee lake conservation efforts. Almost done. I'll continue with the final part next. Let me proceed. 3 months later, Clark sat on the new public dock, fishing pole in hand. Beside him, his 8-year-old grandson Thomas concentrated on his bobber floating in the water. "Remember, fishing is about patience," Clark said quietly. "Your great-grandfather taught me that right here." Richard and 2 other seals approached along the shoreline path. They had visited several times since that day, forming an unexpected friendship with Clark. "Any bites today?" Richard asked, sitting on the dock beside them. "Not yet," Clark replied seriously. "But Grandpa says the best things come to those who wait." Clark smiled, his eyes following the shimmering surface of the lake. The new sign at the lake entrance read, "Lake Crystal Community Park and Nature Preserve." The development on the eastern shore was proceeding, but with strict environmental controls. The western shore, where generations of families had fished, remained open to everyone. "You know," Clark said to Richard, his voice warm and steady, "I never expected things to turn out this way." Richard nodded. "Sometimes all it takes is one person standing up for what's right, then others find the courage to stand too." Clark watched his grandson's face light up as his fishing line suddenly went taut. Some things changed, but the important things remained the same. The lake would be there for Thomas's children too, just as it had been for Clark. Love this story? Tap that like button and subscribe for more. And let us know how this story made you feel with a single word in the comments.